Alright, so welcome back. In this particular video lecture, I'll be focusing on some of the points of our discussion from week 1, but also focusing on the 2 introductions. The first is Mimi Wen and Tuilin Tu's introduction to alien encounters, Asian Americans in popular culture, and the introduction to Latina popular culture by Michelle Habel-Palan and Mary Romero. So these are the first 2 articles listed on the course schedule for the week. Alright. So one of the things I noticed as you were discussing online last week is that there's a lot of, I'm really impressed by the way that you all understand hegemony. But then also important is the ability to talk about ideology, right? In our diagram of hegemony, ideology is what links the subordinate group to the dominant group. On the one hand, the dominant group works through force, but at the same time gains the consent of the subordinate through ideology. We can understand ideology as those specific things, those specific ideas, those specific ways of thinking and feeling that seem like common sense, that link us all to the way that hegemony works. So think about specifics. So for example, a particular stereotype or a particular racial project can be understood as an ideological project, right? Because it's filled with specific ideologies that either comply with the way that hegemony works or seeks to break the chain of consent and work towards resistance, or just seeks to change the way that consent works, right? So, if we're talking about ideology and hegemony, we are all subjects of ideology, right? And in this way, ideology works in 2 different modes. On the one hand, we are the subjects of ideology, right? In terms of grammar, ideology is all about people interacting with one another. It also has specific messages for the ways that people interact with one another. For example, a couple of you focused on the specific ideology of criminality and the way that it gets attached to specific races. Some of you focused on the model minority myth and how that gets attached to specific races. We can understand those as specific racial ideologies. On the other hand, we're subjects of ideologies in terms of the fact that we are all subjected to ideology. Ideology is the way that power works. So on the one hand, we are the subjects like the grammatical subject. On the other hand, we are subjected to like subjects of a higher power. So in talking about being a subject in these 2 ways, we then get a basis for understanding 2 key terms that pop up over the course of the readings of this week, and most likely over the course of the semester. On the one hand, talking about subjectivity, and on the other hand, talking about discourses that are subject-less. So, on the one hand, we have subjectivity. We can understand subjectivity as referring to the ways in which we make meanings, personal meanings, of all these different ideologies that circulate. So for example, how do I know that I'm Asian American? On the one hand, because everyone tells me that I am, right? The way that race operates culturally to designate different bodies. But on the other hand, I know that I'm Asian American because I've made a significant identity and a sense of self around these kinds of experiences and understandings of myself. So this interplay between what happens externally and what happens internally, these can all be understood as modes of subjectivity, right? Subjectivity as something related to identity and our sense of self. And so talking about race and ethnicity is kind of a more easily understandable way of talking about subjectivity. But we can also understand all those other adjectives and roles and titles that we have as modes of subjectivity as well. So for example, as a graduate student, I might describe myself as intelligent. So, you know, it seems like this very whatever sort of thing, I'm smart, whatever. But think about the way that the word operates ideologically. I am intelligent in comparison to something else. So we can understand the intelligence as a subjectivity as a form of value. Plus, what makes me intelligent in this sense is that I am well-read in particular genres of writing and very skilled at particular modes of reading. So We can understand how intelligence as a subjectivity here makes me a subject of a particular intellectual order, right? You need intellectuals in order to teach people, in order to make good capitalist subjects so that we continue working as the superpower that the US is, debatably, right? So subjectivity is the way that we make sense of ourselves in relation to all these modes of ideology and subjection. So both the Introduction to Alien Encounters and the article by Lisa Nakamura talk about the possibility of subject-less, thinking about a discourse as subject-less, removing the subject, and then talking about it as a mode of critique. What does this mean? All right. So subjectivity focuses on these modes of identification with ideology. To talk about something as subject-less is to drop out the subject, right? To drop out the individual, and then to really focus on the ways that power works. So we can understand subjectivity and subjectlessness as mapping onto our key terms of identity and difference, right? Subjectivity as what makes sense of ourselves, subjectless as critiquing the specific constructions of difference. So there are all those words in front of every time I talk about difference, because when we're talking about things being socially constructed, ideas being socially constructed, and identities being socially constructed, we're not accepting them as being inevitable, right? The inevitability of things is part of the way that hegemony works. So for example, if we excuse the way that things were in US history, whether we're talking about race, gender, sexual orientation, or class, oftentimes we say, well, it's much better now than it used to be. That is precisely ideological, because what happens is that we drop away all of the contributions of, for example, second wave feminism, or the LGBT rights movement, or the ongoing civil rights movement on behalf of African Americans, Latinas and Latinos, Asian Americans, and indigenous people. It just seems like it's natural that we're, for example, less racist than our parents are, which ignores all of the politics that have taken place underneath. So we're focusing on the specific events that happen, the specific actors that happen, that have such a huge impact that they change the way hegemony works. Right? So in your journals, for example, I don't want to read about you talking about the Latino community if we're talking about a specific comic strip. I want you to talk about the author and the illustrator, because those are the specific actors who are involved with representing subjectivity or with working through a subjectless discourse and critiquing the constructions of difference. Okay, so here we're starting to unpack our different terms that come up. On the one hand, we have racial identity versus racial difference. So we can understand racial identity as related to subjectivity, right? The ways that people make sense out of these categories that are foisted upon us. We can understand racial difference as focusing on the specific ways that ideologically different bodies are constructed as difference. And this is a response to the question to last time's lecture. The reason why we don't accept race as biological is because, yes, people have different phenotypes, but it's through culture that we assign them meaning, right? We don't pay as much attention to the phenotypical difference between, say, a Jewish American and an Italian American as we do when looking at the difference between, say, a Chinese American and a German American, right? It's not because the phenotypes are so starkly different, it's because culturally they are encoded as representing different types of bodies. So then we get to this difference between ethnicity and nationality. Ethnicity we can understand as our relationship to this imagined social mode of heritage, right? Some of you may have very strong relationships to a particular ethnicity, and some of you may not. We can understand ethnicity as being closely related to this sense of ethnic culture, however you may celebrate it or not celebrate it. This being opposed to nationality. Nationality as referring to our relationship to particular nation states. So if we're talking about nationality, we then could be talking about official recognized forms or imagined forms. In talking about official modes of nationality, we'd be looking at formal citizenship and cultural citizenship. Formal citizenship